Thank you all so much for kicking off NeoCon with us here at IIDA headquarters for our Advocacy Roundtable. I'm Emily Kluzinski. I'm the Director of Advocacy at IIDA headquarters. I'm really excited about the program we have for you guys today. The Advocacy Roundtable has really evolved from an event that back in the day only IIDA members attended, and they came together to share updates about what was going on, and we've kind of progressed it into a panel discussion with a panel of experts on grassroots advocacy and the political process, and turned it more into an interactive conversation. We find that hearing from those outside of the design profession really helps interior designers to gain a better perspective on the advocacy process. So I hope that provides you with that today. Whether you're a working professional, a student, or new to the design field, really IIDA believes that anybody can be an advocate for the profession. We believe that regardless of your background, you can have an impact and help elevate the commercial interior design profession to the respected status that it deserves. So with that said, I want to introduce our panel of experts that are here with us today. On the end there we have Dan Buksa. Dan is the Associate Executive Director of Public Affairs with the Academy of General Dentistry, which is located in Chicago. Also with us is Susanne Molina. She is a recently inducted fellow of IIDA. She has served on the International Board of Directors for the past 4 years and has helped set the strategy and plan for the advocacy department for IIDA. She is currently a director at Clowder & Associates, an interior design and planning firm in Los Angeles. And then we also have Jessica Newbold with us. Jessica is a legislative consultant for Giordano Consulting Services in Springfield, Illinois. Jessica represents various clients in Springfield, including the Illinois Interior Design Coalition, who actually had introduced a bill this session to give qualified interior designers stamping and permitting privileges in Illinois. My goal for this program is to be an interactive and engaging discussion. So I'll be moderating the panel with some questions that we've come up with, but I want to encourage everyone to just ask questions as they see fit. We'll also set aside about 20 minutes at the end specifically for questions at the audience. But if a question comes up during it, feel free to raise your hand, and I really want this to be an interactive conversation for everybody. Just lastly, I want to mention we have some literature on the side here if anybody's interested. It is collateral that IIDA has developed on being an advocate for interior design, and also a handout on what interior designers do. So it's a great resource if you're new to being an advocate in the profession. There's great tips in there on how to talk about what you do, as well as if you're going to meet with a legislator. It's a nice leave behind for what interior designers do in the commercial field. Lastly, I want to just announce that IIDA will be hosting our first annual advocacy symposium later this fall in Austin, Texas. So if you like what you hear today and are interested in learning more about advocacy, please consider attending. More information is available on our website. So with that said, I think we'll get started with our panel. And we're going to start off with talking about, this is for Susanne. How have you seen the advocacy efforts of interior designers evolve since you started in the design profession?
I just to give you a little bit of background, I actually got started locally in California, getting involved in advocacy, wanting to advance the profession. Can you hear me? Wanting to be able to, really basically wanting, it was kind of self-serving, wanting to be able to stamp and seal my own documents. I would say at that time, the industry in general, the way that we approached advocacy is that we expected others to do it for us. And so, you know, most states have their own coalition, and so we would look to that coalition and we would look to them for updates and why isn't anything happening, but not getting engaged necessarily ourselves. In the time since then, I would say in the last 10 years, things have really started to change. And I'm actually very excited. Much of it has been happening here within IIDA with our VPs of advocacy, where they have taken on a much more engaged and active role in the process, and they understand that while there is a coalition, and while the coalition is the one who speaks directly with the legislators for the bulk of the time and the lobbyists and such, and we'll get into that, they understand that that voice is not sufficient, and that it needs to be a much more expanded voice, and that you, the voter, does have a say. Your legislator wants to hear from you. You're the ones that are putting them in office. And so I think we're starting to realize it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of a few, it really takes everyone to speak up.
Great. And Dan, how have you, that same question to you, but how have you seen the advocacy efforts of dentists evolve throughout the years?
There's been a real significant increase in advocacy efforts in dentistry. I've been with the Academy of General Dentistry for 18 years now in a number of different capacities. But when I started, it was essentially a one-person shop. Now we have 3 distinct areas: traditional government relations, insurance advocacy, and interprofessional relations. We've increased our budget. We've obviously increased our staff, other resources. We've retained a lobbyist for federal activity in Washington. And likewise, many of our sister organizations, if you will, the other allied dental organizations, have seen a similar kind of increase in their activities. So there's been a substantial increase in the scope and amount of activity across the board.
Great, thanks. And Jessica, same question to you, but how have you seen advocacy efforts in general, just throughout your work in Springfield? How have you seen those evolve?
I've definitely seen an increase in participation across all trade associations and their members, and that's partially, I think, due to social media and the increased use of email and the internet. It's easier for people to get involved, so more people are doing it. And whenever you're involved in lobbying and advocacy efforts, just one form of communication isn't enough. You've really got to use more than one. You've got to keep swinging the hammer. And I think that that mentality is also helping associations reach more of their members, and more of them are seeing the importance of these issues, that it affects your livelihoods. You know, just as Susanne said, we are lobbyists. We do have the relationships with the legislators in Springfield, but a lot of these issues affect your bottom line. And it's your story that has more of an impact than what we're able to do. And I've just been seeing a lot more participation in terms of that.
Great. Jessica, what kind of impact can students have on the advocacy process specifically?
I think that the students can offer a very interesting and different perspective. We have the professionals who've been involved in the industries, but we also have students who have a renewed energy, and we have students who are learning the cutting edge of what's going on in those industries. And I think that legislators often have very close relationships with the administration at their universities, but they also enjoy hearing the inside view of what exactly is being taught in those classrooms. And I think that students are very effective, just as effective as the professionals, in reaching out to their legislators.
Susanne, how can students be involved in advocacy at IIDA?
Well, and if I can just touch on what you were saying as well, what we are finding is that legislators are very interested in students. They see them as future constituents, but they also see these individuals who have gone forth. They've spent a lot of money, their parents have spent a lot of money on their education, and there's nothing worse than having those students come out and they graduate and they have this debt over here, or their parents have this debt that they're going to be paying off for however long, and they can't practice to their fullest, or they can't find a job that will allow them to practice. So there's that side of it. Also, we are finding that, to your point, Jessica, that a lot of legislators do come up. They're either serving on advisory boards in schools, so that's a very important thing to look at. So from that standpoint, I would highly recommend, as you're going forward, get your students, get your campus centers involved. Get them to understand that, yes, they're students, but they do have a very, very strong voice, whether it is signing petitions, whether it is sending messages to their legislators, whether it is calling them, going to the local office and reaching out. It's very, very important. And if they can make a trip, to the Capitol, whether it's just, a day at the Capitol or if there is an opportunity to testify, they should absolutely do so.
John, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to, back in following up on what Susan is saying, my name is John Gall. I'm the VP of Advocacy for Georgia and the state coalition president. But when Georgia was pursuing its legislation, the students were probably one of the most influential factors. We actually had students write letters talking about their investment in their future and paying for accredited degree programs and what that would mean to them to be eventually the requirement to have that kind of a degree to become a registered interior designer in Georgia. We had students do a letter writing campaign to the legislators and then took busloads of them up to the Capitol, and it had such an impact that I think the legislators saw that there was no way they could turn us down. So students are very crucial to the process.
Right. Okay, kind of moving on to this question about regulating interior design. And one of probably the biggest public policy issue for interior designers right now that we are working on throughout the country is professional regulation. And as many of you know, a handful of states do regulate interior designers. A handful also do not. So when you're kind of in the trenches and you're fighting that battle, and this is for any of you, how would you suggest handling a legislator who is not supportive of government regulation or licensure in general?
I'll go. Well, first and foremost, whenever you're dealing with a legislator who doesn't see things the way you might see them, you cannot take it personally. And I think that sometimes that's one of the most difficult parts of our job, because we are so passionate about this, it means so much to us, that when somebody disagrees, it's hard to listen to. So first and foremost, you can't take it personally. You've got to remain calm, cool, collected, friendly, and you've got to really listen. You have to really listen to what they're saying and what their reasons are, and just continue to come back to them with evidence to pull them over to your side. It's a long road sometimes because there is a lot of misunderstanding about a lot of the industries, but you've just got to keep communicating and keep coming back over and over, and you can't give up on it.
I would also agree. You need to have a very clear message going in. It also matters whether you have legislation already in place and there's an effort to deregulate, as opposed to pursuing new legislation or even just strengthened language perhaps to whatever bills you may have in place. But again, have a very clear message, know who your opposition is, know what their points are, that you can address them. Headquarters and Emily and Abby have been great in putting together talking points, and those talking points include responses to what the opposition is saying. The other thing too is, as you have the opportunity, and if you have the opportunity, this is truly a golden opportunity to speak with a legislator. It doesn't happen that often. Oftentimes it may just be staff. Take that opportunity, make the most of it, explain why it is that you're pursuing this, okay? And I think one of the things that we have really tried to do here at headquarters is to clarify the message from we're just pursuing interior design legislation so that we can practice to our fullest, to a message of we're looking for legislation for those working in the code-impacted environment. Mm-hmm. That is starting to resonate with the legislators because they're looking at a lot of these shows that are on HGTV and whatnot, and and they may know other people that are practicing certain aspects of interior design, and they don't understand why you would need to be licensed or registered for that, and they're absolutely right. Our profession is this big, but it's really this portion of the profession that we're looking to regulate, and that's what we need to get across, that we're not trying to prevent people from doing what they're passionate about, what they love, what they've gone to school for, but we are really trying to be able to provide the opportunities for those to practice to their fullest that have truly studied for that.
My organization has somewhat of a different perspective and different situation. Of course, dentistry is very highly regulated. Every single jurisdiction has a State Dental Practice Act, and every state has a professional licensing board, the dental board or dental examiners, whatever it is in that particular state. So everything's absolutely perfect. No, not so much. One of the big things that's keeping me awake at night these days is we have the introduction of what are commonly known as mid-level providers into the profession. So dentistry has been regulated for perhaps 150 plus years. Is that better? Individuals are coming in now being promoted by certain advocacy groups that are not licensed, and they are wanting to do much of the same things that dentists are doing, including surgery, but not having the schooling or the degree. So it's a great concern to the dental profession. And specifically of how to handle legislators who do not support our positions, we don't have a PAC. We do work with the American Dental Association, which is sort of the umbrella organization for all of dentistry. They do have a PAC. But our focus mainly is on education, and so we will go to the various legislators. Even if they oppose our position continually, we just won't give up, and we'll keep going to see them. We have a U.S. Senator in one of the New England states who seems to take a certain delight in antagonizing us and our members, but every year on our Hill Day, we go up to visit him. And similarly, in states, we have a state senator who is a national leader in the opposition camp, if you will, from one of the Plain states. And we have every opportunity we get, we take the time to talk with her and let her know that this is our position. We're not changing our position. We're not going away, and that we really have the oral health of the public that we need to protect.
Great. Jessica, maybe if you can touch on just why legislators think it's so important for organizations to do their due diligence with opposition.
Well, the atmosphere, I can only speak to the atmosphere here in Illinois, but many of those legislators do not want to have to choose between two organizations that they might consider friends. They have a really difficult time, for example, right now, with our regulation bill, one of our largest opposition groups is the architects. And many of those legislators do not want to have to choose between their friend, the architect, or their friend, the Interior Design Coalition. So it's really important to them that they see these groups come together and at least try to hash out their differences and to come back to them with an agreed bill that they can vote yes on. We all know that this isn't a perfect world, and not every time are we going to be able to come back with a bill that both sides agree on, but that's definitely the optimal situation to our elected officials. At the very least, they do want to know that conversations are happening between the two sides, and oftentimes whenever I approach a legislator to let him know my position on a bill, if he's already heard from the other side, he'll immediately say, have you reached out to Susanne? They'll tell you exactly who you need to talk to on the other side, and that's the first thing you've got to do. You don't want to come back to them and say, no, I didn't talk to her. And the other side of the coin is often these conversations between the opposition and the proponents result in an amended bill that turns out to be better than what the original bill was. So it's very important to be involved in conversations with people that may not share your same opinion.
And that's especially true, you're talking about the architects. I wish that was our only opposition. As we know, within the interior design profession, we have probably 10 times as many opponents that we call our own that are opposed to anything that we may be pursuing. And again, they come out, and I know in the case of Illinois, you had a list of all these opponents, and as we were going through it, it was actually frustrating and a little laughable as well as we were trying to dissect that. But that happens across the country. Once you start reaching out, some of those will fall off, as is the case with Illinois. Some of them have already fallen off. And oftentimes it is truly just a matter of a misunderstanding. You'll be surprised as you're going through this how many people don't read the language that's being proposed. And they're listening to something that someone said somewhere and taking that as the gospel truth, or they're putting their spin on it, and then it's like playing that game of telephone. By the time you start from the first person to when it gets to the end, it's a completely different story, and that oftentimes is the case when it comes to legislation. So do reach out, even if you can just maybe neutralize them. It doesn't mean that you have to get their support, but if you can neutralize the opposition to where they're not coming out against you, that is equally as valuable.
Great, and this is for anyone on the panel. Who do you think are the most effective groups influencing legislation today, and why? And what are some of the tactics and strategies that they use that allow them to be so influential?
I would love to say that dentistry is the most influential, but that's just not the case. We have some opponents who are very well funded. There are a couple foundations, famous foundations, that are literally pouring millions of dollars into their advocacy efforts. One of the organizations is, although they claim to be separate, they are the same name as a company that makes super frosted sugar bomb cereal that has an impact on children's teeth. And there's a libertarian advocacy group out in many of the states run by a couple of brothers whose name is the same as a soda, and they are pouring $1 million a year into their advocacy efforts. So a lot of it is almost like a tsunami of money trying to overwhelm organized dentistry.
Prior to joining Giordano Consulting and working with the design and construction industry, I worked for a little over 6 years with the Realtor Association. One of my most favorite things about that trade association is they have a three-tiered structure where they have lobbyists at the local, state, and federal level. And they are so organized that they've got individual realtor members who are assigned to each elected official at every level of government. So when a call to action is sent out on an issue that they're facing, they're able to immediately have these people, these members, who are able to call these legislators and personally discuss the issue with them. And it's very, very effective. And I know that they're quite large here in Illinois. They've got tens of thousands of members. But I do think that that type of structure can be mimicked by smaller associations, because it is so important to be able to organize quickly when an issue, when a bill is getting ready to be heard in committee or being voted on the House or Senate floor. It's really important to get your message to them as quickly as possible.
And I think to that note, you don't have to have, it's obviously helpful if you have a lot of funds to be able to help you and to throw money towards the legislators. That always helps. However, there are industries like ours that are not that heavily funded, and so then it really becomes that grassroots effort. What we keep hearing, and to your point, is reaching out to the legislators, developing that relationship is really invaluable so that you become that go-to person when those issues come up. The key thing, though, here is that don't become that person that keeps calling that legislator, that you become a pain in their neck. And they really don't want to hear from that person. Oh my God, Suzanne's calling me again. Really? What can I do to avoid her? So you have to be really careful about how you go about this. You want to be able to establish a relationship. If you have time with them, with their staff, keep it succinct. keep it to the point, don't extend it, be cognizant of their time.
Great. With that said, maybe Jessica can touch on this. Do you see smaller associations making a difference in shaping public policy on the state level?
Absolutely. I think every type of member association has the ability to have a positive effect on their industry at the government, by being politically involved. Associations typically, their members are professionals. Their members are held to a higher standard than other people who might be doing the same job. So legislators do love hearing from those individuals. They love hearing from their constituents. They love hearing how issues that are being voted on in Springfield affect their constituents' livelihoods. So I think associations of all sizes definitely have the ability to impact legislation.
I would totally agree with that. My organization is, we're international, but we only do advocacy on national in the U.S. But we also have a structure where we have state chapters in all 50 states. And those state chapters are absolutely crucial. The connection that they have with both their state legislators as well as their national legislators cannot be underestimated. One of the things that we tell them when we have our Hill Days and education sessions is that they individually, many of them, have a very unique opportunity in that they are the personal dentist of a state legislator or a federal legislator. And guess what? When that legislator is sitting in the dental chair, they have your full and undivided attention. And we encourage our members to really make use of that. Likewise, our members, as probably many of the interior designers, your members, are pillars of their community. They belong to the Chamber of Commerce or other civic organizations. Maybe they go to a country club or to a place of worship or any kind of thing like that where they come into contact with legislators. And so we encourage them to maximize those contacts. And recently we had a great success. We had a Hill Day 2 years ago, and one of our members from Iowa went to one of his Iowa senators, federal senators, and invited him to his office when the senator was back home in Iowa. And it was a great opportunity, and we just continually to emphasize that. Invite the legislators into your office. Show them what you do on a day-to-day basis so that they understand our issues. And it's really paid off for us.
And if you can't get a legislator to come to you, don't be afraid to go to them. Many of you probably live very close by your state senator or state representative's office, closer than you probably think. So just stop in, and to piggyback on a point that Susanne made earlier, you might not be able to talk to that elected official, but don't treat their assistants or their office staff any differently than you would the elected official, because they are the gatekeeper, and oftentimes those conversations can be just as influential as the conversations with the elected official.
And the other thing to keep in mind as well is that your officials may have term limits, and so they may term out. It doesn't mean that the staff is changing. Oftentimes that staff will remain, and so establishing those relationships with them, getting them to understand the issues, can be incredibly valuable.
If I could add too, staff are absolutely crucial. One of the things our members notice that when they go in, especially to DC, is that they'll be talking to somebody 22, 23, just a year out of college, and they're like, does this person really have any influence? Yes, absolutely, beyond a doubt. These are the legislator is not an expert at all areas, and so they designate their staff people, as you probably well know, to cover certain areas. So we would go see the health legislative assistant, and these young people tell a U.S. senator or U.S. congressman, or even on the state level, this is what this organization does, this is how it impacts your constituents, how it impacts your district or state, and this is how you should vote on it. So staff, regardless of their age, very crucial.
Great. Just want to switch gears here a little, and one of the issues that interior design coalitions sometimes run into around the country is the idea of a uniform title. So right now there are various regulated titles around the country. There's registered interior designer, certified interior designer, licensed interior designer. And that's sometimes a big topic of conversation here. You know, is it important for everyone to have the same title? Does a tiered approach work for interior design? So although a uniform title would be ideal, does the mixture of different titles have a negative impact on interior designers? So to Dan, does the tiered approach work for the dental profession? There are dental assistants, hygienists, and then general dentists. Does that seem to work well for the profession?
Well, for a certain part, or a certain point of view, I guess it does. There are dentists, which, as I alluded to earlier, are licensed by the individual states. The various assistants in some states have their own licensing boards, and in other states they do not. So it's not uniform across the country. The one problem, as I mentioned earlier, though, there are individuals trying to get into the profession who are not licensed or credentialed in any way at all, which is of great concern. So again, it varies from state to state. I guess dentistry on the top level, as far as dentists go, is a little more fortunate, and there is that recognized uniformity.
From the standpoint of the interior design community, you know, what I hear oftentimes is, why are there so many different titles? It's definitely a frustration. There would be nothing more wonderful than to be able to have one title. Unfortunately, we lost the title of interior designer, just plain interior designer, a number of years ago. There's so much opposition against that. It's never going to happen. And so from that standpoint, what we have been trying to do is we have been trying to come up, again, state by state, we've been trying to come up with something that works, whether it is registered interior designer, licensed, certified, whatever that may be. The reason for that is that when it comes at least to interior design, all politics are local, unfortunately. It's not a federal issue. It's probably not going to be a federal issue for a very long time to come. And so each state looks at it differently. They respond to titles differently. You know, they may be more amenable to having registered interior designer as opposed to licensed. That's a tough one to get. You know, certified may sit better with them. But what I would encourage you is don't get hung up on the title. Don't let that be the crux of all your energy. Take a look at the scope. And the reason that I say that is if you go across the country, and there are a number of states that have legislation, interior design legislation in place, and that's wonderful. But if you really start drilling down into it and look at what the language is for that, that's where the real frustration comes. You may have certified interior designer in, I don't know how many states right now, I should know this, but the scope is completely different from state to state. Same thing for registered interior designer. Focus your energy on the scope itself. You know, I can only give you a personal story where in the state of California, where we have certified interior designer, and depending on who you talk to, they will tell you, oh yeah, we can stamp and seal our drawings, we can submit them. We can only do it for a very limited prescribed scope. And it's not until people actually start going to the building departments of the bigger cities, whether it's Los Angeles, San Francisco, wherever it may be, that they suddenly realize, oh, we can't do this. So it really comes down to working on a clear scope that everyone can agree on. And as Jessica was saying, you know, you may start out up here, you know, aim high and start out with the ideal language, but be prepared to have to come down. You're never going to be able to start out here and end up here. It's just not going to happen. You know, politics is something that happens with all parties involved, opposition included, and so it is going to be watered down. Any win is a win, and then be prepared to come back and try to build it back up to where you'd like to see it.
Do the different do the different terms have any legal repercussions or implications at all? Like, certainly license sounds more vast and official than certified. But is it just a matter of terminology and it all comes back to whatever scope is?
It is a matter of terminology. It all comes down to the actual scope that's in there, but what we're finding, what we have been pushing for is that probably the ideal is registered interior designer, and the reason for that is because of the International Building Code, where it references registered design professionals. So if we had one to pick, I think that would be our choice.
And that's also in like a lot of RFPs, like government RFPs, they are asking for registered design professionals to respond, so.
Yeah. Provides consistency.
Hi, I'm Becky with the Maryland Coalition, and in Maryland we have certified, and we can stamp and seal, but we've been having a lot of issues with individual counties or somebody in that county approving that stamp or recognizing it. So that's been a huge issue for us. So we'll stamp and they'll be like, well, you can't stamp that, or they'll pick out one little thing, they'll say, no, you're not allowed to stamp for that, you've got to have an architect do it.
Right.
And we've had a lot of architects push back on that, saying, no, you shouldn't be doing this, we need to do it. So that's been a huge issue for us.
We found, especially if the economy starts to get soft again, we found that building departments do tend to do that, where they try to push work towards the architects and try to get very nitpicky about it. One of the things that we would recommend, just as you're reaching out to your legislators, reach out to your building officials. I mean, they have a lot of code seminars, things like that. Get involved with them, let them be aware of the education that your design community is going through and how knowledgeable they are about the codes. That'll help make that a little bit easier.
Right, and actually the coalition in California is doing just that. They're reaching out to the local building officials to educate them really on what interior designers do. Jessica, could you maybe touch on the title that the Illinois Interior Design Coalition has chosen for their legislation?
I can. We've been defending this title a lot this year. The bill that we introduced in January references interior designers as licensed design practitioners. The reason that we chose that was because we wanted to try to get away from the general term of interior designer, because that from the get-go we learned is causing confusion among our legislators, because they do hear the term interior design and they just immediately think generically. They think paint, pillows, carpet, things like that. So we wanted to try to mimic what happened in the medical industry with the nurse practitioner. So we went with design practitioner, and the way that we wrote the scope of the work, many of the licensing bills in Illinois make reference to each other, and they make reference to licensed design professional. So that would include architects, structural engineers, and licensed design professions like that. So what our bill is attempting to do is to include licensed design practitioner to be referenced as a licensed design professional. So that was our thinking, and we have part of the pushback that we've been receiving from the opposition is this is the first time we've ever heard this term throughout the nation. We don't feel like that's a great opposition argument because we aren't talking about the nation, we're talking about Illinois. And we were reading the feedback that we were getting back from our Illinois legislators, and so that was the reason that we're trying to go in that direction.
That just shows how innovative Illinois designers are.
That's what I say. That's what I said too. I always say, often whenever there's a big piece of legislation that's a change in a state, sometimes Illinois is the first. And maybe this is another example of where we'll be the first design practitioner. So.
Great. John?
In that same vein, in terms of licensed design professionals, in Georgia we have one of the best pieces of legislation in the country. We're registered interior designers and we have the ability to stamp and permit drawings. But we, on the other hand, in terms of licensed design professionals, our lien laws only allow all of the other design professionals, with the exception of interior designers, to place liens on their clients who are not paying for some reason. So that's one of the issues that we're trying to get categorized in with those licensed design professionals in Georgia. If that lien law ever gets open, we hope to introduce verbiage that includes, among landscape architects, and so on and so forth, the term interior designer as well.
Great. Dan, this one's for you. How did the dental industry determine a division of scope was required and or appropriate initially, if you have any background on that?
So I could probably talk for about an hour on this, but you'd all have to go get a couple cups of coffee to stay awake. Dentistry has evolved over the years, and there are currently 9 recognized specialty groups. Among them are some ones that you probably have heard of, such as orthodontists and oral maxillofacial surgeons, pediatric dentists, endodontists, periodontists, prosthodontists, and a couple other ones. General dentists are not considered a recognized specialty. There is an organization called the Commission on Dental Accreditation that is partners with the U.S. Department of Education, is recognized by Department of Education, to determine the specialty groups. And it is a lot of inside politics because there are a number of niche procedures that have their own groups that periodically petition for recognized specialty status. And those may be anything from implants to lasers and a couple of other items. So it's a lot of internal politics, but over the course of the years, dentists have determined that in order to best serve the oral health of the public, certain dentists need to focus on just particular areas of the mouth or the oral cavity. And if that meets with the approval of the recognizing body, then that becomes a recognized specialty. And a lot of it has to do with being able to bill and just have more leverage within the political arena. So it's a little complicated, and it's an ongoing process.
Great. Susanne, do you want to touch on how interior designers and IIDA has been tackling the scope issue?
The actual scope, or okay. So as we alluded to earlier, we find that every state has different language, that has language in place. And much of it has been there for a long time, and people think, oh, we have legislation, it's great, we can just keep doing what we're doing, until you find that suddenly you can't, submit for maybe a certain scope. And that was kind of my aha moment years ago when, we had certification, or we have certification in California, we've had it for a long time, and it wasn't until I actually started to read the scope that I realized the problem isn't that not every building department will accept our stamp. The problem is that not every department has been reading the scope. And all they see is that there is a certification in place, so they should be able to accept it, except for those jurisdictions that have actually gone in and looked at it and realize that the scope is so vague, or it is truly for a prescribed very small scope that we can, submit our drawings for. That's where the problem really comes into play, and that's where we here at headquarters, along with our vice presidents of advocacy, have really been trying to, one, get the message across, as well as with the coalitions, that what we need to be working on is we need to be working on a scope, and that's something that we are working on, to be able to come up with something with a uniform scope that at the very least, as your states go forward, as your coalitions go forward to introduce legislation, that you have a starting point, and that would be, again, that would be the optimum, and and what that title would be, and what that prescribed scope would be, and then from there, it'll vary state by state again. For those of you that have legislation in place, I think being able to look at that optimum scope and analyze it against what scope you currently have will be beneficial, so that as your bill comes up, whether it's for a sunset review or whatever it may be, there's always a period every few years where you can go back and revisit it. And just as you're revisiting it, your opposition is revisiting it, and they have opportunities to go for deregulation and such. Take those opportunities, be prepared for those opportunities, whether it's to strengthen what you currently have or just to fight for what you have.
I'm Joan Kaufman, I'm from Illinois. I'm also licensed in Florida. One of my questions relating to scope is regarding public projects. So for instance, like a capital development board project. Typically the RFP, request for proposal, comes out and it's defining a scope of work, which is specific to commercial interior design. Yet, when we go to submit, we're required to prove that we have an architect on staff. Well, that's not allowed in Illinois, unless your firm is 2/3 owned by an architect. So we're ineligible for capital development board work to provide interior design services. The only licensed profession allowed to provide interior design services in a public contract is an architect. So that's right there, to me, they're two completely different professions by name, as well as by definition of scope of work. And I think that would be a very viable place to start, is use the language that the state themselves are using in public projects that defines our scope of work, and then tells us that we are not qualified to do our own scope of work.
Well, and I know that in the Illinois, the proposed Illinois scope, they have addressed that. There are a number of states where that is the case, where you need to have a majority ownership. And I know recently for Massachusetts, a bill was just passed that allows the interior designer to hold the contract. The unfortunate part is that for those firms where it may be a 50-50 ownership of architect and interior designer, they're left out in the cold because they don't have a majority ownership. So, but I mean, that's another thing to look at as well. It's not just the scope, it's also how, what's the structure of the firms, whether it is a small firm or a large firm. You really need to look at the entire package.
Right. Okay, so this is the final question that I have, and this is for Dan, and then everybody else feel free to chime in. But how does the Academy of General Dentistry work with other dental associations to advocate for the profession? Is the mission always consistent between the organizations? And if not, how do you deal with different missions or goals?
So there's a distinction between federal and state. On federal level, we work very closely with the American Dental Association, and we have a coalition called the Organized Dentistry Coalition, probably about 15 organizations in DC, and probably 99.9% of the issues we're completely unified. We work hand in hand, and there's very close cooperation and collaboration. On the state level, it's a little different. The state level is where some of the scope of practice issues we were just talking about come into play, and there's turf battles between the specialists who would say that, well, I'm the only kind of dentist that can perform orthodontics or whatever case might be, versus the general practitioner who's able to say, both through the profession's code of ethics as well as most state dental practice acts, that if you have not limited your practice to a certain procedure, you can do all procedures that you, the dentist, are qualified to do. So on a state level, it's more of a turf war, a battle, and many of the organizations are out in open conflict.
Great. Jessica, can you perhaps touch on, when you're in Springfield, do you see that associations that work with other associations from the same profession, is that a stronger advocate when the two groups are working together?
It is. And a quick example of something that I worked on, it was my first year of being a contract lobbyist. We introduced a bill that was going to overturn an Illinois Supreme Court ruling that had to do with mechanics' lien rights on foreclosed properties. The contractor group that I was representing in that situation, we were the ones that were really championing that cause. And it was us against the Illinois Banking Association. And what we were able to do was we were able to pull in not just one other association, but we were able to pull in, I think we ended up pulling in 8 other associations. So we became this gigantic coalition where it was the first time, and Illinois legislators commented on this, it was the first time where they felt like they were seeing the entire Illinois construction industry and design industry come together and advocate on an issue. The Interior Design Coalition was one of our coalition members whenever we were fighting that issue, and it was very, very effective. And it went a long way in reaching out to the legislators and letting them know how important it was, this issue, to the design and construction industry in Illinois. And we ended up being successful. It was the very last day of it would have been the 98th General Assembly. It was during lame duck session. And we needed 60 votes to get that bill passed. And does anyone want to guess how many we got? 60. But that was enough. So we were very happy. So it is really important whenever you can to bring in multiple groups that can help you advocate, because that increases the number of members, the number of individuals, just the number of people who are sharing the same message.
And to that point also, it's an opportunity, usually we're looking for people to help us, look at opportunities to help others. If there are, maybe some of those people that have been opposition and they're now neutral, if you can help them on an issue, do so. Reach out, help their voice to become stronger. It will show that you're being very sincere about your efforts. Make sure that you continue the conversation, and then hopefully as you move forward and you're looking for people to help you, to help support your bills, then hopefully they will come and support you as well. It goes both ways, definitely.
And just one more thing, that is something that I often say to our members. The person that you might be at odds with today could very easily be your friend tomorrow. So it's very important to not burn any of those bridges and to just keep your minds open to who you are able to work with, depending on what your history might be.
And especially with lobbyists.
Yeah.
We've seen lobbyists, who one day are literally, our opposition, whether they may be with the architect or they may be with someone completely different. And then, that client lets them go, doesn't renew their contract, and 2 years later, all of a sudden they're sitting in a different position. Be professional, just kind of like the same thing with our clients, be professional, watch what you say, and try not to do anything or say anything that can come back and haunt you.
All right, great. So it's about 10 after 10. I want to just take this opportunity to anybody that has a question, feel free to ask the panel.
I was just going to comment on California and some of the things that you said today, and to share with the group. This year we made a lot of progress with all of the various organizations that were at odds with each other, and how that is so important not to have the diversion within our own profession. So we've made a lot of strides. And I went to a Walk the Capitol Day in which some of the opposition is NKPA some of the time, and conversations on a face-to-face basis took place. And they were going, oh, we never really understood that you're affected that way. Like, it was just this epiphany among everyone, like, oh, wow, we really don't understand each other. And so that only really was able to happen in a face-to-face day that our lobbyist had scheduled. And we'd like to have more of those. And it just was a really good use of time. But it's taking a long time.
It does take a long time. And to that point also, when you do have those opportunities to meet with your opposition, you know, whether it's doing the, I'll call it the due diligence for, you know, for the legislators, you know, you're trying to find common ground, hopefully, you know, and very rarely do they oppose everything in its entirety. So if you can't get them to agree or to be neutral, look for those commonalities, look for those components that they are in support of, you know, and at least start there, you know, find that starting point, develop that relationship. It will help, it will start to change. They're not going to be in that position forever. Hopefully you're not going to be in that position forever. You do get a little burned out. But, you know, do work at it. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It takes a long time. You know, if we look across the country at all the various legislation, there's been a lot going on. And I also do want to share one thing that we just found out. If you have legislation and you feel really good about your legislation, that doesn't mean that you can become relaxed about it. And the reason that I say that is we just found out that in Florida, which does have one of the best interior design laws, they just took out the term or title interior designer out of their law for the building codes. But this is huge. So it's going to be an uphill battle to get that back in there, and it definitely opens up the door for future deregulation efforts. So don't be passive. Just because you have something doesn't mean everything is wonderful. You need to be very aware of what's going on.
Great. Any other questions?
Jessica, you had mentioned the value of quantitative data for legislators. What can we do as designers to build that data pool? Because I know that, you know, there are certain studies, but we never really have the right information. So what can we do to start building that body of knowledge? Like, who does that? I feel like we're all just waiting for someone to do it.
Well, one of the things that has helped us as we were having discussions with legislators about our bill this year was Louis and I had asked for plans on the specific things that you guys do, and that was really effective in being able to take your blueprints, your plans to the legislators and saying this was done by an interior designer, not an architect, and to be able to show them, you know, the egress and the fire codes and all of the codes that you guys are following whenever you're making those designs. So if you have the ability, you know, to in all of your free time as a professional, to share any of that with your local representatives or senators, that really went a long way. The other thing that we did was we showed them comparisons of the architecture programs and the interior design programs at some of our state schools, and they were very surprised at how similar those programs were. So that's something else that was very beneficial to us in our conversations.
If I can jump in real quickly, emphasize the economic impact on the legislator's district or state. In other words, there are 100,000 people employed in our industry, and we generate $50 million annually in economic activity.
And as we've been telling our VPs as well, not only is it that part of the economic impact, it's also who your clients are that are in your legislators' districts and what you're doing for them. You know, you develop strong relationships with your clients. You know, they're usually long-term relationships, and oftentimes those clients are willing to reach out on your behalf. Take advantage of that, but they're not going to do it unless you ask them to.
Back on what she noted, as students, would we be able to submit our work? Because we touch base into architecture with all the coding as well, and showing our education behind it before we even enter the field.
Absolutely. And just to let you know, an example of where we have used student work is at our lobby day activities. I don't know if you've ever attended those or not, but at the reception we've shown the student projects and what you guys were doing. And the legislators that showed up at that reception were really blown away that that's what you guys are learning how to do. So that was very effective, and I think that you should absolutely submit your work as a student as well.
We also submitted the NCDQ exam, and that was really huge because then they saw what they were tested on. That was really eye-opening.
And we did that as well because the biggest part of our opposition kept saying this year that interior designers aren't well-versed or educated in health, life, safety issues. So whenever we showed them what you guys are being tested on, that also helped. But we have got to keep on having these conversations. So.
Someone mentioned earlier some pushback in terms of various counties within their state who are maybe not recognizing the law. And in Georgia, even though we have a good law, it is law, but we're not law enforcers as the coalition. So one of the things that we're trying to do is put together sort of a packet that we can send out to designers to present that includes the verbiage of the bill and explains the bill, and where there have been code officials who have cooperated with it. Some of them are willing to sort of attest and be a contact for those other code officials. We put together sort of a packet, a response packet where we're seeing those kind of pushback situations. But I wondered if the panel had any suggestion about enforcement of the law. I mean, we do turn to the Department of Community Affairs sometimes.
Well, that's what I was getting ready to suggest, that the enforcement of it would come from the Department of Financial Professional Regulation in Illinois.
I think it depends on the state. I know in going back to California, we actually met with CALBO, which is the California building officials, and you would think that they're the ones that can reach out to their local jurisdictions and say, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you accepting these? It was a bit of a frustrating meeting in that they basically said, yeah, we understand your frustration, but there's nothing we can do about it. They basically come up with their own rules. I mean, they have local jurisdiction. What we are doing, however, in that case for California, and this is kind of a long-term goal, as we also try to strengthen our scope, is that we are working with CALBO on developing a credentialing program that designers can take classes or courses that CALBO puts on, whether it's Building Codes 101, ADA, whatever it may be, but that there is a certain number of courses as well as some prerequisites that you would need to take, that at the end of that, then you are credentialed. And the end goal is that if we can't strengthen our scope, that at least having done this credentialing course will then require the building departments, or will give the building departments that much more comfort in accepting our stamp. So that, I mean, there's different ways of going about it. Again, I hate to say it, but all politics are local. When we go to the building department before we ever even start the project, we reach out to those building departments to find out, what are your local laws? We know what the IBC is, but what are your local interpretations, whatever they may be? Do you have additional restrictions or things that we need to design that we need to be aware of as we move forward with this project?
What kind of relationship do you have with your state's Attorney General?
I haven't really approached the Attorney General about it, but are you recommending that we do that?
I would become friends with him. Absolutely, invite him to your receptions and events, or her to your receptions and events, and just become good friends. That's one individual in most states who's in charge of enforcing the state laws.
Yep. Great. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. Can we give a big round of applause for our panel?